evening, everybody. Thank you so much for making time for being here. And thank you for the hosts and the co-hosts. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts. Actually, what I'm going to present is a little bit of a mix of different things that I've been looking at for a number of studies. So I'm mixing some of the work that I've done, as Jeremy was mentioning, on innovation in the informal economy, taking an opportunity to tell you a little bit about our fundings and about sort of the types of innovations that we found. And then I'll try and draw some connections with the emerging maker movement and the different modalities of innovation hubs that we find in the continent. So I'm not presenting one study per se, I'm just giving you a little bit of a flavor of different things that I've been working on. So this is the title, but yes, let's see what the slide says. I have to admit that I don't see the slides from the top, so I have to sort of see simultaneously there and here to know where I am. So apologies if there's a little bit of a delay. So let me start by just talking about innovation. I mean, I come from the innovation studies literature. I'm an innovation scholar, this is how we call ourselves, which is very much sort of like an interdisciplinary field of study. Most of us come from the field of economics, but it's a mix between economics and political science as well. And that's why you'll hear me talking about innovation a lot. But I wanted to start with this statement just to highlight that policymakers all over the world are talking about innovation and emphasizing the importance of innovation as a driver of prosperity and economic progress. And I just picked up literally a few random statements that I could find very quickly, just to illustrate that it's across the world that we find this. It's not only in the West. As you can see, two of the statements there they relate to North America and Europe. But the last one refers to a statement that was made by Cyril Ramaphosa, which is the current president of South Africa, the day after that he was sworn as the new president earlier this year. He made the statement, "Our prosperity as a nation depends on our ability to take full advantage of rapid technological change, and this means that we urgently need to develop our capabilities in the areas of science, technology and innovation." Something that was mentioned as an issue of key importance, and we are really taking that to heart, because we are currently in the process of revising our white paper on science and technology, which was originally developed in 1996. The situation in South Africa is quite interesting because, as I will mention here, and a lot of the things that I will highlight during my presentation have to do with this contrast that we find. And in South Africa is very, very evident that we are performing relatively well in the continent in terms of science, technology and innovation. We have quite a sophisticated institutional infrastructure to support innovation as compared to some other of our neighboring countries. When you look at all the indicators in terms of number of researchers, number of patents, technological developments, in all of them we sort of, go ahead the league in terms of performance. But at the same time, that performance is coexisting with growing inequalities, growing levels of exclusion, huge levels of unemployment and poverty, and so on. So we find this world of contrast coexisting. And the reality is that innovation can coexist with growing inequality. These questions have been posed over the years to governments, to different agencies supporting innovation in South Africa. And there's a clear understanding that innovation has to be put at the service of distributed goals. We have to ensure that innovation is a tool for inclusive and sustainable development. So this is where my angle comes from. The term innovation is relatively new. Innovation policy, sorry, is relatively new. And I just wanted to show quickly this slide because it's a study from Jan Fagerberg, who is also a very well published innovation scholar. And they just released this study last year showing that the frequency of the using the term innovation policy. And you can see that even though it's been around for a while, it's really peaked in the early 2000s when we hear innovation policy being more frequently used. Doesn't mean that innovation policy didn't exist before, but perhaps it was labeled differently. We didn't call it innovation policy per se, but you can see that it's very much at the center of the policy agenda. So what is the connection between innovation and development? Why do we care so much about innovation? So pretty much we focus on the economic impact. So we hear how innovation is important to increase the productivity of firms. We link it usually to competitiveness. New firms are formed, therefore new employment is generated, even though the impact on employment is a little bit ambivalent. So we are not sure whether it's going to wipe out. Artificial intelligence is going to destroy all our jobs, so it's going to create more. But in general, we see it as a tool to diversify economies and industrialize. However, there's more and more interest, as I mentioned, especially in the South African continent and the African continent, to use innovation to address social issues. So we are asking for the social impact. How is innovation changing the lives of people? Right? Especially those living in poverty or marginalized in different ways. So we want to see innovation as a tool to address social problems, to improve well-being and health, to generate opportunities for disadvantaged communities, to redress some of the spatial and geographical imbalances and so on. And even more, we are starting to think about how can we use innovation to address or to reduce some of the environmental impacts of economic and social activity that we engage in. And in this respect, we can see a lot of work that has been done on innovation and low carbon activities and conservation of natural resources and so on. And very quickly, I just want to mention these are the 17 SDGs that we have all subscribed to, including African countries, and the connection between this and innovation is something that we're still trying to unpack. But really, what these indicators are doing are trying to link our understanding of economic prosperity with people, dignity, justice, and ultimately the planet. Right? So the goals of innovation are becoming wider, broader, more complex to achieve. Africa is part of this trend and this concern, and this is this document, the Agenda 2063, is the document that summarizes the vision of Africa for the next 50 years or so, and it's called the Africa We Want. And you see as number one, the aspiration is about having a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And I'm going to refer to that inclusive part with my with my presentation. Sorry, I'm trying to coordinate two sets of slides here. The African continent has been, the narratives about African development have shifted from a picture of despair and doom. And I don't know if you remember that in the early 2000s there was an article by The Economist that talked about the hopeless continent. And it was very influential in terms of creating that narrative of Africa as a hopeless place. And then the narrative changed completely, and we had the same publisher describing Africa as Africa Rising, with a very, you remember, in 2011. So since that time, there's been a string of reports talking about Africa as finally entering a new era of sustained growth for various reasons. We talk about lions on the move, and gazelles, and all sorts of metaphors to describe the way in which the continent is moving. mindful of the differences that exist between the 54 countries, I will not treat Africa as a country, but I will try and extract some generic lessons from the work that we've done. And some of the avenues that I will be looking at involve looking at technology refer constantly to building on what we have. We look at innovation, science, technology, innovation as something that we need to have, that it needs to be imported from elsewhere, that we need to learn from elsewhere. We don't have it. We need centers of excellence, therefore we copy the model from elsewhere. We need science parks, therefore we copy a model. And I think our approach to innovation and innovation policy has to be very much based on an exercise of self-reflection and a really true assessment of how can innovation be put at the service of inclusive and sustainable development. With this idea of building on what we have, I will start by mentioning what we have, which is our greatest asset, which is our people. So our current trends of population is that Africa is expected to almost double its population by 2050 to 2 billion people. Currently, half of the population in Africa is less than 25 years of age, and it's been estimated that by 2035, 41% of the youth will be in Africa. So we'll have the largest labor force in the world, larger than China's. And this is a great asset for the continent, but also it's a great challenge. And the reason why is because 3/4 of our youth is unemployed or vulnerably employed. We have a huge amount of people that are joining the labor market every year. And most of the studies are showing that that in the future, where are the jobs going to come from? And most of the studies are showing that entrepreneurship is going to be the way forward. Most of the jobs are going to come from what is known as household enterprises, which are mostly family-run, largely informal, cash-based enterprises. So this is where the youth is going to occupy itself. The issue of skills is another question that we're not going to talk about now. But when you look at entrepreneurship, you can really see in that slide, and this refers to the youth. I'm not sure how much you can read the figures, but you see new and nascent businesses are much higher in sub-Saharan Africa than in other regions of the world. So in this respect, Africa's response to demographic challenges affecting the youth are really proposing entrepreneurship as central to the solution. You can argue, okay, well, it makes sense in a context where the opportunities of formal employment are so reduced. We may find a lot of necessity-driven entrepreneurship. But when you look at the figures as well, you can see that, I'm not sure if you see it, Sub-Saharan Africa is the third one in that graph. You can see that even though necessity, is there a pointer here? Necessity is the blue and the orange, and opportunity is the green and the dark blue. You can see that necessity entrepreneurs are not necessarily higher as a proportion to total entrepreneurship as compared to the other regions. In fact, you find a larger proportion of necessity entrepreneurs in regions such as non-European Union. So most of the entrepreneurship is based on the perception of an opportunity. I'll come back to this point when I talk about informal entrepreneurship. This is what I want to talk about when I talk about innovation in the informal economy. So I want to talk about entrepreneurship, the type of entrepreneurship that exists in the African continent, the one that is predominant, and the opportunities that exist. What are these entrepreneurs doing? Are they surviving? Are they innovating? Are they contributing in different ways to knowledge creation, to economic and social development, and so on? So let me spend a few minutes talking about the work that I've done on innovation in the informal economy. Just very quickly as a broad definition, in ILO, the International Labour Organization, defines informal economy as all economic activities by workers and economic units that are in law or in practice not covered or sufficiently covered by formal arrangements. This is a very general definition, and I won't go into the details and differences between informal employment, informal enterprises, and informal economy. If you would like to look more into that, there's a paper by Professor De Beer here and others that goes into the detail of these different definitions and so on. But the informal economy is particularly relevant in Africa, and as you see, it exists everywhere. You can find informal economic activity everywhere, but particularly in Africa and in different sub-regions of Africa, such as Western Africa, Central Africa, and so on, we reach figures of more than 80% of employment outside agriculture. It's not something that is marginal, it's not something that you can ignore. If you want to talk about economic opportunities and economic activity in the context of Africa, you must take into account the informal economy. And we may have the perception that most informal entrepreneurs are surviving, right? When we think about an informal entrepreneur, we're thinking about perhaps a woman selling oranges on the side of the road, perhaps somebody doing some basic activity to survive. But the evidence is showing us something a little bit different. Actually showing us that that even though we may find the category of the survivors or the lower tier, as different academics have different ways of classifying and informal economic activity. But we find within the informal entrepreneurs, we find those that are there to set up their own businesses because they want to test new ideas. They are using actually the informal economy as a test bed for innovation. They are trying new things. Some of them want to be their own boss. They have the intention of growing their businesses, and they constitute quite a substantial percentage of informal entrepreneurs. You see them as called as the professionals, the upper tier. Also, you find a big layer in the middle of the resourceful or the middle tier that have created the business not for reasons not related to market constraints, but for other reasons. And in some cases, we find those also innovating in different ways. And using a sentence that was used by OpenAir in one of your publications in 2013, that was just before I joined the network. I remember I read that publication and it stuck with me because it made the argument that informal is normal in an African context. And when you look at the figures, it is very true. So the informal economy constitutes about 2/3 of non-agricultural employment. It's about 1/3 of the African GDP. In places like in Kenya, it's generated about 90% of the new jobs, 83% in Nigeria in 2016. In South Africa, the majority of micro-enterprises are informal. There's a study that shows that 60% of firms that make less than 300,000 rand a year remain informal. And so it's a question of size rather than other factors, but I will get there. And also it's on the rise in pretty much all countries. So contrary to the perception that the informal economy will disappear somehow with modernity, we see countries growing economically, doing better in terms of innovation and technology development, and at the same time growing the informal economy. So the informal economy is there to stay. The motivations for the work that we've done is based on one, that large set of evidence that show us that the informal economy is really at the core of African economies, and also evidence that the innovation in informal enterprises has potential transformational effects. in terms of entrepreneurship, resilience, cooperation, and social integration and so on. So we have a lot to learn from understanding. It's almost like a microcosmos of activity that teaches us something new about innovation, that we can extract generic lessons that can be transferred to other parts of the world, really. At the same time, it remains invisible in all conceptual approaches and also approaches to policy. So, so we looked at innovation in various studies, and OpenAir is very active in coordinating a large number of studies across Africa, trying to really capture and to identify what is the nature of these innovations done by informal entrepreneurs. So I have a few illustrations here of innovations that we found in Nairobi, in one of the informal clusters of metal workers. So let me just mention very quickly two of them. I won't go too much into detail because I'm mindful of time, and I understand that we also want to have a little bit of a discussion. But one of the examples here on the right is the example of improved chip cutters. This is a metal worker in an informal cluster in Nairobi that one day has a customer that has a chip cutting machine from abroad. He's never seen it before. He's asking for it to be repaired. So what he does is reverse engineers. He basically pulls it apart, learns how it works, and then rebuilds it. He rebuilds it, and then he realizes he can rebuild it with recycled local materials. He can take local materials and sort of rebuild the machine himself at a much cheaper price. And he's also adding some of the features to that machine that makes it more relevant and more usable in the context in which he operates. He starts manufacturing this machine. Basically, it's an adaptation of foreign technology through reverse engineering. And he's now selling it to other informal entrepreneurs that are setting up a business. Chip cutting is for chips, like fried chips. So other informal traders can now set up a business and make a livelihood out of that. So something like this is a technological innovation. We may have something in mind when we think about technological innovation. We may think about nanotechnology, biotechnology, building satellites, aerospace. But the reality is that these kind of innovations have a huge transformational impact in the livelihoods of people. Being able to afford this machine probably would cost, I don't know, $5,000, $6,000 if you buy it from the original source. If you buy it from this person now, it's much more affordable. It allows for a livelihood. It allows for a whole family to make a living through that innovation. So similar to the case of the improved cook stove depots in Nairobi. So due to infrastructural issues that many of us that are familiar with developing countries, we know that many people rely on firewood for cooking and heat, and they use these stoves, the metal ones that you see on the left, the silver ones. Those ones use a lot of wood, and they also produce a lot of pollution in the house. So somebody came across this idea of having a ceramic liner and making them in a shape that was much more energy efficient. And they not only use less wood, but they also minimize the amount of smoke coming out of them. So this is an improved cook stove that spread like fire, literally, through the informal cluster. And that is one of the points that I want to mention about innovation in the informal economy. When somebody's got a good idea, it's copied. It's copied very quickly, and that has a lot of implications in terms of knowledge appropriation, intellectual property, and so on. And some of these clusters are structured in such a way that you have to see what others are doing. You can't really keep your invention for yourself for very long. And what happens is that new ideas travel very quickly. So now you find a variation of this improved cook stove pretty much in any informal shop in Nairobi. And I'll come back to that, about the dissemination of new ideas. We also have collected examples of new sophisticated equipment to pack traditional medicines in Ghana and so on, but I won't go into that. And like this, there are many examples. And there are very interesting examples of those custom-made matatu manufacturers in Kenya. That is also a story of reverse engineering, buying a new vehicle from abroad, undoing it, and developing features that are in line with customer taste. That has a great influence in their businesses. Informal carbon fiber clusters in Uganda and South Africa, very interesting cases of how IT services innovate in Nigeria. In South African townships, you find manufacturers of coffins that are made with recycled furniture. And we did a study as well about homemade products, soaps, and other cosmetics in South Africa. Innovations that included a lot of indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge in terms of making the soaps and cosmetics much more aligned to cultural preferences of different customers. Something that I wanted quickly to touch upon is on how people on learning, and there's this perception that the levels of education in the informal economy are very low, and what we found is quite a lot of disparity in terms of the levels of formal education in the informal entrepreneurs that we have interviewed through our studies. So in some of them, it's true that the levels of education remain quite low, but in others we found quite a high percentage of informal entrepreneurs with a tertiary education, such as it was the case in South Africa. 32% of the interviewees had a tertiary education. This tells us something about the connections that exist between the formal economy and the informal economy. A lot of them were people that had jobs in the formal economy at some point, and they left it or they complemented it through their own business in the informal economy. So it tells you that informality and formality is not a dual concept. It's part and parcel of the same economic reality that the people's economy. It's people that you can't really separate it that much. You have the same individuals having a job or performing activities in the formal economy and having their own business. And that's also coming with other changes in the youth, especially when we refer to the youth. We see changes in the structure of career and work. It also has to do with the prospects and the perception of the future in terms of work for the youth. They are really understanding that they have to mix informal work with your passion-driven project with a wage-paid job sometimes, and it's becoming more and more accepted. So informality, and we see it in different sort of media outlets and so on, that you find these examples of a successful informal entrepreneur that has done extremely well for one reason or another. So in a way, we are sort of like capturing this idea, these experiences, making them visible and valued at the same time. So there is a change of perception about informality. Just very quickly, the way learning takes place in the informal economy has a lot to do with interaction. I won't go too much into the whole theory behind it about innovation systems, even though I'll mention it a little bit. I can't help it because I work on innovation systems and I need to say a word about them. But what is important is that a lot of the learning that takes place, and again it has implications in terms of how do we understand education and training in our continent, we have to really start valuing other avenues and routes through which people acquire knowledge that is not necessarily just by going to formal education or tertiary education. And the reality is that in the future, we've seen the trends of population growth and the youth. A very small percentage of that youth is going to go to university. Let's face that reality. So how is this youth going to acquire the knowledge that they need to carry on with entrepreneurship and with making a livelihood? A lot of this knowledge is acquired through informal means, and is acquired through learning on the job, learning by doing, learning by interacting with others. So this is what we call interactive learning, which is essential in the informal economy. And what we did, is also again coming to my innovation systems approach. We tried to look at these businesses not in isolation, but in connection with a constellation of actors and stakeholders around them. So I think this is essential because it allows you to see where the strengths are, where the gaps are, what kind of interactions and linkages need to be strengthened in the system. Because economic activity, as I say, is part and parcel of a constellation of actors and organizations that exchange knowledge, combine knowledge, recombine it, and turn it into something new. So that is what innovation is about. So what we did is we tried to map in each of these studies what is the innovation system around those entrepreneurs. And we found the connections between informal manufacturers and formal manufacturers, the formal suppliers, informal retailers and so on, and also with other organizations, education organizations, knowledge transfer organizations, representation organizations and so on. And also through qualitative analysis we were able to assess the strength of each of those arrows. So the arrows are the most important part of the system, otherwise you have isolated actors doing their own thing. So what we look at is at the interactions and the exchanges that take place across. So even though those connections were extremely important, they didn't happen as much as we would like to see. So we saw that even though informal entrepreneurs perform innovation as part of a system, exchanging knowledge with other actors, we saw that still that was one of the limitations that was reported by one of our studies. So in this study, for instance, that we did in 4 African countries in 7 subsectors, 74% of the respondents indicated that they didn't find it easy to get business support from outside institutions. Outside institutions meaning part of that constellation of institutions that I mentioned in the earlier slide. They didn't find it easy to organize training with external providers. They didn't find it easy to get loans or financial support from external institutions. When those connections took place, the results were phenomenal. So this isolation is really something to address. So these are some of the features that we try to look at all of these instances of innovation and try to see, okay, so what is common to all of them? What lessons can we learn? What can we learn not only about the way in which we approach innovation, but also the way in which we approach education and training, and how we approach intellectual property, how we approach different aspects. So these are some of them that I wanted to share with you. Those are the features of innovation that we found as common to most of the studies. Even though in South Africa and Africa in general, we have very clear targets about national R&D. We want to have 1% of our GDP invested in R&D, research and development. We see that as the basis for innovation. We think scientific research is the main source of innovation. And even though scientific research is critical for innovation, it is not the only source. And this is confirmed by our studies, that many more firms innovate than they do R&D. These firms are innovating and they are not doing R&D. That has policy implications in terms of identifying gaps and areas for intervention. Many of the innovations that we found, most of them were collaborative. And as I mentioned, if you adopt a systemic view, you start seeing where the arrows take you, and you realize that these innovators are actually collaborating, exchanging knowledge openly with peers, with suppliers, with customers, And those collaborations were crucially important in the innovation activity. Also, this idea that innovation has to be this big thing. It has to be something that comes out in the news, in the front page. We found that a lot of these innovations that were extremely impactful and transformational were actually small changes, were incremental changes, like the example that I gave you about the chip cutter. It's not somebody that comes up with a new machine. It's somebody that is reverse engineering and adapting it and localizing, domesticating that technology for the use in the community in which he or she operates. So they're not new to the world, they're new to the firm or the context in which they are. They are mostly about adaptation and adaptation of existing technologies by recycling, reusing, minimizing resources, in many cases ascribing to the principles of the circular economy. Right? So it's about reusing, recycling as much as possible. That makes sense in a context where getting new materials is quite difficult. Copying and diffusion. As I mentioned before, the sharing of information and the imitation and copying and the Me Too kind of business is very much predominant there. And this sharing is driven by particular social dynamics that happen in informal settings. So these are communities that are tightly interconnected. They depend on each other for many things, for getting by many of the obstacles of daily life. You need your neighbors, you need your peers, you need your community. And that leads in many cases the way in which people share knowledge and behave with one another. So copying and imitation is not seen as a negative thing in many instances. It's seen as a way of giving back to the community that supports you. It's very closely connected to markets, and that connection with the demand is critical as well in terms of the success of the innovations. And I will come back to that later, but having that very intimate knowledge of local needs is something that is a critical advantage for informal entrepreneurs. And somebody was mentioning the other day, I had a conversation with somebody and we were talking about, the next Google. Why doesn't Africa have its own Google? Right? And that conversation took us to say, it's like we know what is needed. So these guys, they know what is needed on the ground. The guy sitting in Google doesn't know what a person in a Kamukunji cluster needs. So that is something that is something that we need to appreciate and to nurture in a little bit more of a deliberate way, I think. They are able to respond very quickly to market demand and supply. They have the flexibility that larger firms don't. And they also constraints-based innovation. So they can innovate under conditions of scarcity. They do innovate precisely because of the conditions of scarcity to try and solve problems and overcome some of the shortcomings. So those features of innovation resonate, I'm sure, with some of the businesses that you can find in Canada, that you can find in Europe, that you can find in the West. And those are some of the features that I think is important to share and to learn from each other. How are these informal entrepreneurs tackling this? What lessons can be useful for entrepreneurs in other contexts? Something else, and this links to the next topic, I'm going to move to maker spaces very quickly, is that these entrepreneurs acquire new knowledge by learning, by interacting with each other in a system, but there are still some shortages in terms of skills that are needed. And this is also the result of one of the studies that we conducted recently that picked up a few skills that were reported as less than satisfactory by the respondents. And one of them was computers or ICT skills. I find this extremely important, especially as we discuss the fourth industrial revolution in Africa. How is it going to unfold? Are we ready for it? Are we not? And I think it's very important to see, how ready are we in terms of ICTs. You can't only look at the number of ICT graduates. You have to look at, are businesses equipped with the skills necessary to be able to deal with certain technologies that we link to the fourth industrial revolution. And as we see, the core of African economies are informal entrepreneurs. So I think it's a fair question to ask. Now, how are these businesses going to acquire this? So how can we blend the local knowledge that informal entrepreneurs have about the needs in their context with that input of technology, especially in terms of skills that is needed. And this is where the connection with tech hubs comes in. Because tech hubs have acquired a lot of importance in an African context as well. And I mentioned earlier the focus on science parks. Yes. The focus on science parks. Okay. Am I running out of time? Okay. Maybe I'll take another 10 minutes, sorry. Focus on science parks and others. And I think it's important to understand that supporting or promoting innovation hubs has many different modalities, and there are different forms of doing that. So I wanted to share with you a few slides on this. This is a study that came out this year that has identified 442 tech hubs in the continent. They are quite young, about 5 years old on average, and they are growing very fast. And about 12% of them are what we call co-creation hubs. They were in 2016. By 2018, we have 26% of them as co-creation hubs. Those are very much linked to the studies that we're doing on maker spaces, co-creation spaces. So we did a study that looked at different varieties of innovation hubs in the continent, and we classified, and there are different classifications. You can find a classification by the World Bank, by Prof. De Beer has another classification of innovation hubs, and we have even come up with other classifications within each of these typologies of innovation and hubs. But this is the one that we came up with in this study, and we differentiate between traditional science parks, activity-based innovation centers, and third-generation co-creation models. Traditional science parks, I'm sure you all know how they look like. They are your state-of-the-art infrastructure, trying to attract these high-tech businesses, and they require large amounts of capital investment, and they're usually driven by government. We tried to classify them there. We looked at the Science and Technology Park in Mozambique, in Botswana, and the technology and the innovation hubs in South Africa. Then you have this what is called activity-based innovation hubs. They are generally driven by businesses. So they try to respond to business needs. Rather than focusing so much on infrastructure, they're usually located in the middle of the city, and they try to provide with value-added services for businesses. And then you have the third type, which is the co-creation model. And this is what I wanted to go to. But if you don't mind, I'm going to jump to the last modality for the benefit of time, which is the co-creation spaces. So we've done quite a lot of work in trying to look at the co-creation spaces. They have different names: tech shops, hacker spaces, fab labs. They generally look like this, and they have a bunch of equipment like 3D printers, laser cutters, and different types of tools. And they share very similar ethos of do-it-yourself, peer learning, and so on. So I will try and very quickly mention a study that we did in South Africa where we looked at different maker spaces that are categorized there. So we also tried to classify them, and we saw that some of them are community-based, some of them are university-based, government-based, and so on. Some of the key findings that we found in this innovation, in these maker spaces or innovation hubs, is that many of the innovations are incremental. They are not radical. We didn't find things that were new to the world. We found things that were mostly at the pre-incubation and pre-commercialization process. They also had a talent for recycling and repurposing. I'm sure you start seeing some parallels now with, you can see where I'm going with this. And they were new, as I mentioned, they are new to South Africa and new to the world, not new to the world innovation. They had a very strong commitment to skills development. It was very interesting to see how the users and the key people in these maker spaces, they're quite keen to get out of their comfort zone and go to townships and go to secondary schools to teach kids and disadvantaged communities about how to use these technologies. How can you use this technology? They are passion-driven organizations, and the individuals that drive them are very much interested in passing on the knowledge and the skills. As I mentioned, they were very good on outreach. This is a mobile lab that you see on the right, the iMake lab, that made a trip every 3 months across the country from Gauteng to Santa Lucia. It's quite a long trip that takes about a month to go back and forth. And on the way, they assisted about 300 artisans in rural communities to use 3D printers, to use the mobile lab to improve their products and make a livelihood. The people populating these maker spaces had a very strong tendency to collaborate. They were driven by passion for learning and sharing knowledge, and they adhered to the principle of openness. And you could see that they were starting to collaborate with others, not only nationally but also internationally as part of this global maker movement. So some of the features of innovation and learning that we found in the maker spaces were the prevalence of peer-to-peer learning, based on this idea that there's no superior knowledge, knowledge is complementary. You have something that I don't know, I know something that you don't know. So let's share, let's learn from each other. Skills development through collaboration. I mentioned about outreach, the importance of networking, and entrepreneurship. So this is where, and we started to see coming out from these maker spaces some interesting examples of startups that were blending technological knowledge with this deep understanding of local needs to provide solutions. And there are some very interesting examples of enterprises that have emerged from that merger of those two things. Knowing not only the technology, but also having a very intimate and good understanding of local needs. So just to conclude, these are my final reflections. Informal entrepreneurship has to be seen as a very valid and useful route for entrepreneurship and employment for the youth in an African context. It has to be seen as a valuable asset. At the moment, we are not there yet, unfortunately. Informality is seen as something that has to. We still stuck with this discourse of formalization before knowing what the challenges are. So we need to move away from a single discourse of formalization to really trying to understand informal entrepreneurs as entrepreneurs that have particular challenges, that have particular assets, and try to build up and scale up what they're doing. They do have a very deep understanding of social needs, and they engage in this process of interactive learning and innovation. Micro-entrepreneurs in the informal economy are innovative, and as far as I mentioned, they are largely disconnected from the broader innovation system. So nurturing those linkages and interactions is essential for the promotion of innovation in the informal economy. And then the possibilities to scale up are reliant on these successful partnerships, particularly actors in the system that have a similar ethos, a similar way of operating, where learning from each other, sharing, collaborations are prime. And one of those actors in the innovation system are the co-creation innovation hubs or the maker spaces that I've just mentioned. And I think that's my final slide. Sorry, I took a little bit longer. Thanks.